Thaumaturge is a game that I've had my eye on since its announcement in March 2023. I'm something of a sucker for a good Industrial Revolution or turn-of-the-century era story, with magic and a protagonist who seems like an eccentric magician of sorts. Likewise, everything from the art direction to this creepy-looking demon here had me hooked. So much so, that I was desperate to find out information on how the game would actually play after watching this. But catching my attention like that really isn't enough. I'm very frugal, and nearly always buy things on discount. I don't get sucked into FOMO or marketing hype, so even with my interest peaked and the release price for this AA game set very reasonably, I still held off a few days before deciding to buy now or wait for later. In the end, it was a conversation with several people on a quieter Discord where I hang out that finally pushed me over the edge. I'd been getting lots of wonderful images from their Twitter that only had me more excited with each reveal, and while you can never truly know until you play, I felt there was enough here to gamble on a refund window's worth of gameplay. And while you can't always be correct about these things, in fact, in the gaming sphere, disappointment seems like an epidemic at times, I can say wholeheartedly that this game is time and money well spent. The 2-minute review is that Thaumaturge is an isometric RPG with turn-based combat similar to what you'll find in your classic JRPG. It's a game that leans heavily into its limitations to create an experience that is extremely charming and tightly paced. It's big but doesn't overstay its welcome at all. It tells an absolutely bonkers story featuring even more bonkers people who actually lived, isn't afraid to get dirty and political, teaches you about European history and Slavic folklore, tells a story of love, friendship, family and betrayal that somehow all fits together alongside giant fucking demon battles, and has writing that is funny, characters you actually care about, a world that actually feels lived in, and god damn it if Fool's Theory aren't going to make you live with the consequences of your actions.
Fuck off.
This is literally everything every AAA open world sandbox claims it's going to be, and utterly fails to deliver on. It's a game that was designed for depth rather than breadth, was clearly worked on by passionate people who were having a great time making it, and aside from some needless busywork quests, a touch of BioWare face here and there, and a couple of bugs that received hotfixes the day after I ran into them, this is one of the best times I've had with a new game since... Damn, I mean Dead Space was great, don't get me wrong, but this really feels like it was made for me. I'm not going to cheapen the review by throwing out an arbitrary 10 out of 10 because while I think the Thaumaturge executes everything it sets out to achieve with style, and I 100% recommend you part with your hard-earned cash to play it, there's always room for improvement. And while I'm not going to start screaming Game of the Year in April, especially not in a year with a new Sonic Generations coming out, this is a hell of a contender. The longer review from here will get more spoilery as we progress, similar to how I review other larger RPGs like Final Fantasy IX and X. But for this particular tale, I felt the format I used for my Disco Elysium video would be the best, even though YouTube absolutely doesn't want anyone to know that exists, despite being some of the most heartfelt writing on this channel. So, you know, maybe click that link after you've watched this. So with that in mind, my lords and ladies, my raccoons and cyborgs, werewolves and whatever the fuck this is, my furries and NBs, gather around and let me tell you a story. Our story begins as all great tales should, with a man alone on a pilgrimage through the mountains. As we watch him journey through the South Caucasus Mountains, we hear a haunting voice tell him that she misses him and worries for his health. Our hero is a man who is not well and seems to be trailed by some deathly spectre, though this apparition hardly seems to bother him at all. This narration implies strained ties with his father and a need so great that he is seeking the aid of mystics who may be nothing more than charlatans, and... Okay, first quick aside here, but I really like when writers do this with more modern fantasy settings. As we'll soon see, magic is a very real and powerful thing here in the world of Thaumaturge, but there's also no shortage of bullshit artists and crystal weavers looking to take advantage of the gullible and the vulnerable.
Get a steak for when your life is at stake. Make any vampire quickly retire.
While superstition of all kinds can be traced back to the earliest human cultures, 19th century spiritualism is in no small part the result of two girls known as the Fox Sisters. These two became spiritual sensations when they demonstrated their powers of communicating with the spirits of the dead, which took the form of loud cracking sounds that came in response to their questions. They toured all over America, gathered a massive following, and popularized all kinds of bullshit mediumship like seances and Ouija boards, only to later confess that they were frauds, and the sounds were produced by cracking the bones in their toes. Even after publicly confessing and demonstrating the method of their trick, their following actually refused to believe it, and concocted all manner of absurd conspiracy theories about how the sisters had been pressured into lying that they were lying. Yep, even back before places like Twitter and Reddit made it really easy for all kinds of absolutely absurd ideas like MOAS, the future via Web3, or the culture war to take root within groups of susceptible people, there were still those who'd rather concoct elaborate conspiracy theories than face the idea that the things they'd built their identity around for so long was a lie. I bring this up not only because as a former magician and mentalist myself, I find this kind of thing really interesting, but because we are very soon going to be meeting one of the most egregious bullshit artists in history. I mean, all faith healers are the absolute worst kind of con artist, but this guy, oh boy, this guy was something else. Arriving at the station, our first job is to telegram back to our sister and let her know we're still alive and well and on the right track. When asked for a name to sign the telegram with, our hero gives his own self-introduction.
My name is Wiktor Szulski, S-Z-U-L-S-K-I, and Wiktor with a W, not a V.
Honestly, if my name was that cool, that's how I'd introduce myself too. A trek through a mountain village and a brawl with a couple of Russian soldiers later, we find ourselves in the presence of the faith healer we've crossed half of Europe to find, none other than Grigory Rasputin.
I forgive you.
So, how many of you know what the Sephiroth is? And assuming that you didn't go to some kind of religious school, what was it that prompted you to look into that? I apologize for the somewhat wild tangent. The point is, I did a lot of research on this guy after finishing this game, and may I recommend you do the same because, believe you me, even in a game with demons and magic, the truth is far stranger than fiction. For our story though, Rasputin is a hypnotist and faith healer. The origins or divine nature of his power is something that will be called into question later in the game, but for now, Wiktor wants Rasputin to help him reconnect with his primary Salutor, Upia. So this is our first big mechanic that we need to talk about. Salutors are spirits that come from somewhere. Even thaumaturges don't actually know. In a much later scene where Wiktor meets a young boy at an exorcism, he realizes that the ghosts the boy is seeing are actually Salutors, which makes him a thaumaturge. So that's rule 1. Thaumaturges are born, not made. Given that Wiktor's father and grandfather were also thaumaturges, there seems to be some kind of genetic heritage in the mix, but it's not guaranteed, as Wiktor's sister Liega is not blessed or cursed with this power. Salutors look like creatures from folklore and legends of one kind or another. Fool's theory drew on mostly Slavic paganism for their bestiary of freaks, but there's a couple of standouts like the Djinn that come from Arabic legends. I personally think these shapes are more based on expectations more than anything else. At least 2 of these creatures are actually old gods, and I think it's safe to say that our boy Wiktor here, while incredibly charming, isn't walking around with a couple of deities on a leash. Salutors are attracted to flaws. Flaws are things like ambition, negligence, and recklessness, or rather, since these are all normal human traits, a flaw is when one of these is fed to excess. Anyone can have a flaw, and any flaw, as we'll see later, can attract a Salutor. In most cases, the creature will attach itself to the flaw and fan the flames of it, so to speak, making the flaw stronger and the consequences of indulging it greater. We're not dealing with the subtlest of symbolism here, but the lesson is simply that indulging our vices, or becoming unbalanced, is how we invite literal devils into our lives and conjure hell all around us. While normal people are at the mercy of a Salutor, a Thaumaturge that can see them is in a position to strike up a pact and gain a lifelong friend, a guide in dark places, and a comrade in arms. Wiktor's flaw is pride. I, for the life of me, have never understood why pride is any kind of flaw. And in Wiktor's case, it seems more like arrogance or straight up pig-headedness than just being proud of something. His main Salutor is Upir, and I love this guy, but I'll dissect him later, along with a couple of the others. So Wiktor, in his pride, or arrogance as I see it, thought he was bad enough to tame a wild Salutor and get 2 for the price of 1. This is apparently rare and extremely difficult for a Thaumaturge to do. The ritual didn't go as planned, and not only did Wiktor not get a shiny new Salutor to add to his Pokédex, he also damaged his connection with his first, and if he doesn't get it fixed, he's gonna die. This is why Wiktor is heading to buttfoot nowhere in the mountains of Georgia to see a fabled healer as his last hope. And while Rasputin needs a little convincing, he is eventually willing to take Wiktor into a kind of guided hypnosis to re-establish his connection and in the process square off against a particularly nasty memory of his father. But it works out, and our hero is not only saved, but he's now ready to wield his power again. Which is good because something bad is happening in the small village, and it seems our hero needs to do some investigating. Investigations are the real meat on the bones of Thaumaturge. While there is a larger, what some might call, main story in the game, a great deal of what we learn about this world and its characters are found in all the sub-stories and side quests. These vary from those with Witcher 3 levels of complexity and depth to fairly mundane busy work that really overstays its welcome. We'll drill down into the what later, but for now, let's focus on the how. Thaumaturges have a special extrasensory power. The thoughts and emotions of people can be imprinted on the things they own or sometimes even simply handle for a few minutes. These impressions can't be sensed by normal people, but to a Thaumaturge who is backed by a Salutor, they can be tracked and read as easily as footprints in the snow. This allows them to discover hidden secrets about people, places, or events, and form connections to uncover the truth about various mysteries. Rasputin actually asks our hero for a demonstration of his power prior to granting him his wish, and this serves as our basic tutorial into the system. But no sooner have we reconnected with Upir, and we start to see that all is not as it should be in this quiet little mountain village. People seem to be a lot more hostile than usual, and it occurs to Wiktor that there could be something supernatural fanning the flames of the aggression here. This leads him to investigating a recent death, and uncovering some darker truths hidden beneath. As a gameplay mechanic, it's as simple as pushing the right shoulder button, having Wiktor snap his fingers, and send out a plume of sensory mojo that will either begin sparkling to highlight the nearby presence of something we can interact with, or shoot off in a direction we need to go to find our next clue. It's very similar to Isaac's little guiding light in Dead Space, and acts as a cute compromise between making us memorize the map and having an immersion-breaking objective marker on the screen at all times. Also, by only offering a brief hint of the direction we need to go, we are encouraged to use this power frequently, so be sure to get used to this sound. But this also serves to help us stumble across other things that just happen to be lying along the route we are taking to our objective, which in turn helps us uncover more investigations that can take us charging all over the map and no doubt landing us into all kinds of trouble along the way. When the mojo starts sparkling, you play a little game of hot and cold to reveal your prize. This will probably seem like a very mundane item, but will actually contain some important information about the mental state of the person who handled it last. Incidentally, we get a look at how Thaumaturges can pass coded messages to each other by using this very technique later in the game. Wiktor just holds an onion while concentrating on his desire to meet with someone, before handing it off to another person to pass along to another Thaumaturge, and the magic, as they say, just works.
All of this just works.
Selecting your target object, you'll get a little bit of flavor text about it. It may not sound that exciting, but working through these little treasure hunts and gathering all the clues is actually very satisfying in its own way. When you've connected enough dots, you'll receive a conclusion that Wiktor has drawn from the scene and be prompted on which person to approach or what place to head to next to further your investigation. I will say I think the system would have been more involved if it were possible to reach incorrect conclusions that required us to filter out red herrings and false information. God only knows we all need a little more practice at that these days. But that would no doubt affect the game's pacing, and likewise add all manner of complexity to the system that would either require longer development time or pull resources from other areas onto this. Our investigation ends when we discover a conspiracy for bloody murder and realize our culprit has become enslaved to her own flaw and invited Bukovac, a monster that is known for devouring people in swamps, to hang out and make people much more likely to explode over each other. So no sooner has our hero recovered from his last attempt to capture a wild Salutor, and he's at it again. Though this time, with Rasputin to back him up, he's successful. And we now have one of our major gameplay objectives: to catch as many Salutors as we can and power up our boy here into some kind of uber wizard. The second objective presents itself when we return to the station though, and discover that we have a telegram from our sister. It seems Wiktor is finally going home to attend a funeral, because his father has passed away. Thaumaturge was developed by Fool's Theory and published by 11-Bit Studios. Both developer and publisher are based in Poland. Fool's Theory is a collection of game development veterans from companies like CD Projekt Red, who split off to start their own small studio. There's something very romantic about a bunch of big corpo types breaking out of the high stakes, pressure, and somewhat factory line production of AAA games to create a space where they can focus on following their own creative passions. Kinda like what Rafael Colantonio did with Wolfeye after departing from Arcane. Fool's Theory are currently in the spotlight because they are involved in the Witcher remake, and the Thaumaturge is the first game of this scale they've produced. They've got this other game, 7, that I don't know too much about, but it certainly looks cool. Since everyone involved is living in Poland, setting the game in a city they all knew, and retelling history that no doubt all of them studied in school, seemed like a no-brainer to them, and is absolutely delightful for me, because I never really got exposed to any of this particular history during my school years. Thaumaturge is many things. It's a history of pre-World War I Poland, it's an education in Slavic folklore and mythology, it's an RPG with tactical turn-based combat, it's a story of rebellious socialists battling an oppressive regime with a bonkers monster-collecting side hustle thrown in for good measure, but most of all, Thaumaturge is a family drama. It's the story of a boy who left and came back a man, albeit one who's still got a lot of growing up to do. It's about someone coming home and finding he's too big for his old favourite coat, and still not sure if he's going to grow into the new one. About discovering that maybe he was wrong about his father all along. It's about a brother and sister picking up the pieces of their life after losing someone close. About reuniting with an old friend who's maybe taken a turn for the worse along the way. And for Wiktor, making big decisions about who he's going to be, the life he's going to lead, and what, if any, part he's going to play in the fate of his country and all the people around him. And it all takes place in the Polish city of Warsaw. As Fool's Theory points out in their opening statement, they could not create a game that draws so much inspiration from the past and leave out the portrayal of certain attitudes and views that are, rightly, considered unacceptable today. Warsaw at this point is going through a time of turmoil, and the relationship between the Polish people and their Russian occupiers is anything but friendly, as we see from the moment we step out of the train station and into one hell of a protest. As I said before, my European history isn't all that great. I'll chatter on about Oda Nobunaga or Tokugawa Ieyasu all day, but Russian-occupied Poland is not my area. So please forgive me if I slip up here, as most of what I'll say is condensed from Wikipedia and anything I can steal from the Summer of Marks video on this game. The one sentence pitch though is that the sovereign state of Poland ceased to exist for around 123 years, when, after various conflicts, it was carved up like a birthday cake and shared out one piece at a time between the Russian Empire, the Habsburg monarchy, and the Kingdom of Prussia. This problem only got more complex thanks to Napoleon, and ended with Russia basically in charge of Warsaw and the most populated areas of the country. Now, look, I know that that is a massive oversimplification of a very complex and nuanced situation, but I'm not a National Geographic or History Channel documentary. We are here to talk game after all. But feel free to look into this for yourself if it interests you. The point is, Russia runs Poland, and there's plenty of people who aren't happy about that. Even those willing to escalate a protest from, say, the level of the average football match in the UK to an average day in a high school in the USA. This is one of the many conflicts we're going to get involved in, and even at this early stage, we're put in a position where we have to choose sides. So I went ahead and started a brawl with the cops because, fuck the police, am I right? And that ended about the only way these things do. We are led somewhat by the nose through the opening areas though, and have to attend our father's funeral, wake, and the reading of his will before we really get to step out into our playground. The important points here are that, while Wiktor's father is clearly a wealthy man, he has nothing to leave his estranged son, save his grimoire, that went missing not long after an entire building mysteriously fell on him. Yeah. I think the kids today call that a little sus. This sets up what will be our primary quest through most of the game, as the case of the missing grimoire becomes Wiktor's motivation for getting into trouble from here on out. Also, this may seem like a slight from Wiktor's father Stanislav to his estranged son, and we certainly get the impression in the opening narration that things are more than a little strained between them, especially since that we now understand that Stanislav was an elder thaumaturge who was no doubt a master of his craft and probably had some insight into how to save his son. Still, Wiktor would rather trek through the mountains to track down a faith healer than ask his old man for help. Stanislav's lore is actually a lot more complex than that though, and uncovering the truth of who his father really was, and realizing that his memories of him exist with something of a bias, is another major narrative hook. This is handled through one of the most interesting side quests where Upir has Wiktor relive some of his memories, but without the bias we all attach to them, especially ones where we get hurt. While not the most mechanically challenging quest, it's a great way to show us Wiktor's backstory without just doing a massive info dump, and it introduces us to his bestest of friends, Aboritsi, a man who makes one hell of a first impression.
What kind of a sick idea is this? Kidnapping me?
It's a joke! You don't find it funny?
No.
Stepping out onto the streets is where we get hit with the full force of the game's art direction. Being a AA game, the Thaumaturge has to lean into its limitations. So we have an isometric RPG that calls back to many classic CRPGs of old. Now, I love a good isometric RPG. I played a bunch of them last year and spent way too long making a way too long video about them. But as well as being a great stylistic choice for a classic PC RPG vibe, it also helps hide things like repeating NPCs and lower resolution textures that maybe don't look all that good up close, but help a lot with optimization and smooth play. I did have a couple of crashes during my time playing, but one of the errors received a hotfix within hours of my stumbling into it, so Fool's Theory are taking this very seriously. When we are close up for conversations and cutscenes though, we find plenty of great work on the characters. Wiktor's waistcoats, for example, are absolutely fabulous, and while I wasn't so hooked on the tailor's side quest that I had to get them all, I did get a little pang of joy every time I found a new one. Since we're talking about character customization, you can spiff up your Thaumaturge with a selection of haircuts and magnificent beards, but I found myself sticking with the default look through most of the game. Animations are for the most part very smooth with no major texture warping, and the creative designs for the Salutors are absolutely jaw-dropping. I actually made a point of not looking ahead to see what the next one would be, so that I could fully enjoy the surprise of each reveal. The only real weak point here is the facial animations. It's not all the time, but there's some moments of seeming facial paralysis going on here. As a AA game, retailing at a much cheaper price than the now self-aggrandizing and undeserved $70 that AAA publishers think they deserve, I'm willing to overlook this little issue. Given the challenge facial capture represents, I'd rather praise the times Fool's Theory got it right than highlight the shortcomings. Warsaw is made up of a selection of mid-size maps. These range from areas of high society with beautiful houses and parks, rundown drinking hovels and mud-filled docks, to a bustling market area and even a breathtaking cathedral, all of which are expertly crafted by the game's artists and level designers, and communicate a great deal about life in the city without having to beat you over the head with it. While each map is relatively small, they are all very dense, and each area has its own personality and vibe that helps to create the overall feeling of a much larger city that's filled to the brim with all manner of people just living out their lives. It helps that Wiktor is something of a high society reject. His money and status as a thaumaturge mean he is begrudgingly welcome in high society and can attend soirees with the rich and powerful. But his distaste for it all and his time spent living rough means he'd much rather be slumming it in a dive bar with his best friend, who happens to be an idealistic crime boss with a heart of gold. You know, the kind of guy who'll happily break your kneecaps over a slight, but secretly wants to spend his life writing poetry. The maps are connected by a larger world map that you fast travel around by first heading to a carriage or streetcar station and boarding transport from there. Since the maps aren't all that big, you'll rarely feel like you're having your time wasted just getting from point A to point B, and as you snap that little sensory gift of yours en route, who knows what you'll stumble into along the way. I'd say this is overall a much better system than trying to render all of Warsaw as a massive sprawling city with no loading screens. It helps to keep the pacing relatively fast, and it's pretty easy to start navigating to areas from memory once you've visited them a few times. The main quest is divided into numerous smaller investigations. That being said, while Thaumaturge is happy to categorize its various investigations into main, secondary, and other, there's a surprising amount of overlap between these. Most of the investigations to acquire new Salutors aren't really categorized into the main quest area, certainly not the second tier ones, but I consider a great deal of the game unfinished and Wiktor to be exceptionally underpowered if you didn't go after them. Also, the Salutor investigations are easily the biggest and most exciting stories in the game, and powering up Wiktor of one of these babies is easily as exciting and satisfying as finding your next summon monster in any Final Fantasy game. All of these have Witcher levels of complexity, with some having multiple options for finishing them, and just like in Don't Nod's Vampire, a game I'm actually surprised I've gone this long without bringing up, just because you unlock a special option in a conversation, it doesn't exactly mean that you'll get the best outcome because of it. You can overthink a problem, basically. So Wiktor is going to be getting involved with socialist revolutionaries trying to destabilize the Russian hold on Warsaw, assisting in the formation of labor unions, solving a serial killer case, this being one of my favorite quests in the game actually, especially because of how easy it is to end it badly by not paying attention to one very important line of dialogue.
How could you be so irresponsible and act alone?
Fighting in unlicensed boxing matches, taking on anti-Thaumaturge propaganda groups who have decided that all of their problems are the fault of Thaumaturges and not their life choices, and just getting shit-faced with his crime boss best friend while engaging in numerous bouts of gentlemanly fisticuffs. Yeah. Ooh, magic. The weak point in these quests are definitely the ones classed as urban secrets. I guess these are meant to give us a fuller picture of what it was like to live in these times where things like elevators and Coca-Cola were new and novel things.
Hello?
I talk here? Do you hear me now? Wiktor? Wiktor, are you there?
They're basically your busy work quests with no character interactions or larger story. Just these cool little animated drawings and some flavor text to collect. You also get a shot of XP for finishing them, and since this game doesn't have infinite random battles like many turn-based RPGs, these are probably the closest you can get to grinding in the game. The completionist in me really wanted to get them all, but just like the Riddler trophies in the Arkham games, there's too many by half, and the whole thing overstays its welcome and even breaks the immersion of the game somewhat, with Wiktor seemingly spending entire weeks hanging out on park benches to pass time, while the threat of riots and supernatural death lingers just over his shoulder. Now, there is one important side quest in the second part of the game that gets kickstarted by one of these urban secrets, so just keep an eye out for anything to do with fireworks and go chase that down. Main story and secondary investigations though, well, that's where you really get to dive into the fun of the game. All of these are multi-layered with numerous NPCs to talk to, and each are threaded into the larger social and political scene that's happening in the city. I've pored over the idea of demonstrating at least one of these via case study, but nah. I really think you should go and explore all of these for yourselves. What I can talk about in some depth though, is the Salutors. These are the rewards for the best quests, and each is a delight to track down and use once you've got them. Each Salutor is attached to a person's flaw, and your investigation involves both identifying the owner of the flaw and the nature of it. The moral dilemma here though is that Wiktor has to remove the flaw in order to gain the Salutors' attention. At the very least, you filter off the excess of those feelings and return it to some manageable level. You could argue that this is altruistic and the person will be objectively better for it, but firstly, just like liposuction, a quick fix answer denies you the chance for real personal development, leaving you open to easily relapse. Secondly, you are not only changing something fundamental about a person's identity, you're doing so without their consent. And making people's lives better isn't exactly Wiktor's primary motivation. I quite like all our supernatural companions though, and it's a lot of fun watching them in battle and getting an eyeful of their animations. Salutors are connected to our leveling up system. Each belongs to one of 4 magical paths that we can travel down. Buying levels in a path can unlock new combat options and buffs to use on them, but you need to have a certain Salutor in order to progress past a certain point along a path. Your level in various disciplines will also affect whether or not you can actually read certain traces when you find them, or even use your powers to influence people into doing what you want. Our 8 supernatural beings are all wonderfully designed, modelled, textured, and animated. Well, Valas sometimes comes off a little stiff, but he's still badass, what with him being one of the most powerful Slavic gods and all. While I had a great time tracking all of these guys down, I can honestly say that our best boy is without a doubt, Upir. First of all, that character design. Anyone who can rock that hat is a force to be reckoned with in my book. Since Upir is Wiktor's primary Salutor, they share a much stronger connection, and these guys actually spend a lot of time interacting. I won't say talking, because Upir clearly isn't very chatty, and his lack of facial muscles means he can emote in a very limited manner. This doesn't stop this guy saying 1,000 words with just a tilt of his head and a few impatient taps of his cane. It's very good character design overall, and seeing him go to work with that rapier of his never gets old. But it wasn't until I took to the internet to find out about the mythological origins of this guy that the penny finally dropped, and more so, it had been staring me in the face all along. Look at these letters. Now just say the name without the accent. Upire. What does that sound like? Maybe a certain book by John Polidori? Or a certain game by Dontnod? Yep. Our best ghost friend here is a proto-vampire. Thaumaturge is set in September 1905, so Bram Stoker's Dracula, the book that codified the modern vampire, has been out for about 8 years now, so maybe the image just hasn't been crystallized into the collective unconscious and found its way into whatever hypothetical space that Salutors come from. Again, that's just my theory on the matter, but I'm a Persona weeb. Given how popular my Legacy of Kain videos are, you may have guessed that I enjoy a good vampire story. Leech or parasite-like monsters that steal life force to extend their own in some way are quite common in cultures all around the world. It was a way of making sense of various blood diseases and such back when we had no idea what any of that was. And as the world became more civilized and connected, writers began taking inspiration from these various folktales to construct more elaborate versions of them. This process is quite fluid, and is even continuing now. Even something like a zombie has gone through massive image facelifts over time, inspired by all kinds of different media. The current pandemic zombie that is popular in media today is in no small part popularized by Resident Evil. Sure, Richard Matheson's I Am Legend had plague vampires in it long before that. That book is way better than the movie, by the way. But it all contributed to what we now think of as a zombie, which is far, far removed from its origins. Seriously, watch these videos for more. Oh, and these ones. We have a mixture of great Salutors from Slavic gods like Veles and Morana, tricksters and cautionary tales like Lelik and Bukovac, and one bona fide piece of Nazi propaganda in the form of Krampus. I won't say you gotta catch 'em all, in fact it's kind of better if you leave one in particular for someone else to snare, but you'll have a great time tracking all these guys down, and once you got 'em, well, it's time to unleash them. Combat is quite the tactical affair in Thaumaturge, or rather it has the potential to be extremely brutal and punishing on higher difficulties. Unlike most RPGs, Thaumaturge doesn't have an elaborate system of stats that slowly increase with every level, at least not that it shows you up front. Wiktor starts the game with 42 HP, and finishes the game with 42 HP. Though this is easily enough for him to tank several gunshots and walk away without so much as a stitch out of place on his immaculately weaved waistcoat.
Oh, fuck off, Arkham. So demons and magic, they're fine, but surviving a couple gunshot wounds? That's the part that's going too far. There goes the neighborhood. And other incredulous turns of phrase. Oh, I read you loud and clear, little buddy. I know what side your bread is buttered on.
Hold on a sec. I gotta take care of a werewolf problem. Likewise, the damage doled out by any single attack will be more or less the same from start to finish. I've talked briefly about how we can buy new powers with XP, and these can be used to buff our attacks or add extra status effects to them to make us more dangerous as we progress. So we progress outwards rather than forwards, if that makes sense. Instead of becoming stronger in a traditional linear sense, we gain access to a wider suite of options for creatively destroying our enemies before they have a chance to strike. And that part right there is probably one of the more critical strategies in the game. I guess we couldn't really get through to the end of this without some comparison to Persona. They certainly seem to draw a lot of inspiration from the same place, with you sending out spirits based on folklore to battle for you. But also in both Persona and Thaumaturge, it's generally better to not let your enemies have actions if at all possible. This is because even fairly weak enemies can destroy you in a single round if you're not paying attention or showing them due respect. So Warsaw is experiencing a lot of troubles, as we've talked about, and our rich boy likes to shoot his mouth off at the worst possible moments, landing him in more fights in the space of a couple of weeks than the average bouncer gets into in their entire career. When combat starts, everyone politely lines up just like in your average turn-based JRPG, but in Thaumaturge there's actually some in-game sense to this. Thaumaturges can go into this weird mind space, often used for communicating with each other and flexing their Salutors. Here, time is all but inconsequential to them. So if you want to overthink things, you could argue that this is just Wiktor's supernatural perception working to keep his ass alive. At the top of the screen we can see the turn order. Wiktor usually has a significant head start at the beginning, but it's not always the case with stronger enemies. Down here we have our selection of available actions, and you'll notice by scrolling through each of them, they each have a different speed rating too. It's entirely possible to execute multiple quicker actions before your enemy has a chance to attack, but slower actions will dole out significantly more damage. You get to choose an action for yourself and your Salutor only. While sometimes an NPC will join the fight on your side, they'll be computer controlled. Now, down here we have Wiktor's health and focus. Enemies have focus too, and you have various attacks that can damage focus instead of, or in some cases as well as, physical damage. Breaking focus will cancel an enemy's action and leave them open to your most devastating attacks. These can usually one-shot enemies, and watching them is kind of the highlight of getting a new Salutor. In the case of the Golem, it's just... I mean, holy fuck, I know this guy was trying to kill me, but I genuinely feel sorry for him now. That door swings both ways though, so guarding your own focus is just as important as guarding your health. Each round you'll notice a section of your health becomes discolored. This is Wiktor's foresight telling him how much health he'll have left at the end of the round if he doesn't do something about it. And yes, he can even foresee his own death, so keep an eye on this. There are no dedicated healing spells in Wiktor's arsenal. Instead, some Salutors have attacks that leech health from their targets, though some of the more powerful of these can actually leave you with a pretty hefty debuff in with the deal. You can likewise upgrade your own attacks to heal you, or maybe delay or cancel enemy actions if certain conditions are met. Status buffs and debuffs are also massively important in this game too. Remember that most people can't see Salutors or magic. From the average person's point of view, people who square up to Wiktor just become sick and pass out, or get humbled by more mundane means. Statuses such as suffering or bleeding dole out extra damage at the end of the round, and these babies stack up fast on both your enemies and yourself. Not only that, but some attacks gain damage multipliers depending on how many people have a certain debuff attached to them. So strategically laying these down is a fast track to doing a lot of damage without breaking enemy focus. The Salutor Lelik also has an interesting power that transfers your ailments onto an enemy. It's a little slow to execute, so you have to be careful with your timing, but it's entirely possible to have your enemies help you out by stacking up debuffs on you so you can transfer them over onto their leader and watch him keel over and die without ever lifting a finger against him. The last consideration is enemy buffs. Most enemies have some kind of protection that can reduce or negate one form of damage or another, or grant them status immunity. To break these, you need simply attack them with the correct Salutor, providing of course you have reached a high enough level in that particular Thaumaturge path. This encourages you to switch out your Salutors and experiment with their powers, but it's not something you really need to do all the time. For example, you may have an enemy with really low focus, but a buff that basically cancels out focus damage. Of course, you could have the right Salutor show up and strip it off them, but you may have another strategy to just hit him with physical damage and negate the need to. So with all the elements in mind, you are basically carefully lining up your dominoes and then smashing them with a few solid blows. You delay and cancel your enemy's actions until you either break their focus or they're so burdened with physical ailments they can barely stand, at which point you wade in with the big guns before swaggering away, no doubt twirling your fabulous mustache in the process. Playing on normal, I will say that you have a lot of redundant skills. You can actually get through most battles with a basic skill loadout and Upia if you feel so inclined. The potential is there though, and if anyone here has done a hard mode playthrough, let me know how it is. My only real complaint is the boss fights. They're not terrible, but they don't bring anything new or exciting to the table really. You just get an interesting background. The last boss is also just a slog. Just a really long fight with an extra mechanic that, and I didn't realize this at the time, lets you break your link with a Salutor for a full health refresh, effectively making the battle almost trivial. But aside from a couple of small hiccups, the combat is really great. Before we wrap this up and go our separate ways once again, I want to touch on the dialogue choices and the pride mechanic. Choices matter is an expression batted around by a lot of games marketing, especially AAA open world affairs. I think we're all smart enough to know at this point that choices matter usually boils down to some kind of good or bad binary. They may have gotten more nuanced with it over time, but it's still pretty clear that there is a better or worse option. Likewise, regardless of what you choose, you'll still be playing out the exact same missions, just wearing different clothes and reporting to a different guy. You'd think AAA budgets would allow for more freedom here, but these games are built for scale rather than depth, and publishers are so terrified of you missing anything that it's all signposted and easy to spot. Likewise, you are generally allowed to change your mind right up until the last second. Even My Perfect 10, Deus Ex, and its sequels condense all of your decisions into pushing one of 3 buttons, with factions you've snubbed or even been outright hostile to trying to recruit you right up until the very end. So choices almost never matter in games, at least not in regards to a written narrative. When it comes to emergent story, every choice can matter. If you're playing a farming sim, for example, the choice of what crops to grow on what land can have a huge and lasting impact on your experience of playing the game. I bring all this up because while all roads in Thaumaturge do more or less lead to the same place, god damn did the devs try hard to make my choices count for something by the end. It's actually a little unfair in some ways, but hey, in life we can't always know the longer lasting implications of the choices we make. One of the main ways this is handled is through the pride system. I honestly had no clue what this did at the start. Basically, some dialogue options have this little pride logo next to them, and offer cocky responses that will often land you in fights. Feeding the floor will open up more prideful responses, and some of these are really useful. Later, however, you'll actually close yourself off to lower pride responses because Wiktor is just too full of himself at this point to be humble. So, while the events of Thaumaturge follow a mostly linear path, we can become quite a different person by the end. My only complaint was that none of this was really all that well explained. The game simply tells you that choosing a prideful response fuels the floor. I had no idea I'd actually be locking myself out of conversation options that could de-escalate a situation, and much later on, the game just forewent any illusion of me choosing for myself, telling me that my prideful nature took over and just continued the conversation. More importantly, short of restarting or loading a much earlier save, there wasn't a damn thing I could do to change it. I've been asking games to lock me out of choices earlier like this for a long time, and the moment I got it, I suddenly wasn't sure I wanted it at all. I don't really want to spoil how playing a high-pride game will come back and bite you later, but let's just say, while I got to beat down and verbally lash plenty of people who had it coming, there was blood on my hands that I'd rather have not been there by the end. I suppose it just encourages a full replay versus just loading the last 10 minutes of the game so I can press a different button for a different ending. So that's Thaumaturge, a passion project made by a small team who are all clearly having an absolute ball making it. It feels very much like a smaller scale Larian RPG. That is to say, well, Sven, you can explain it for me, buddy.
The best approach I've learned is that you try to have fun as you make it, and then hopefully that fun is going to brush off on the player, he's gonna have fun too.
The story, the art direction, and all the characters are an absolute blast to spend time with. And I learned so much about history, and some of these people who actually lived, and the time they lived in. This really does feel like someone went rooting around in my skull, found all the things I want from a video game, and threw them up on the screen for me. I'd like to say a game like the Thaumaturge is a wake-up call for AAA publishers, but it probably won't be. Still, I think we all get a lot more value out of these kinds of games than we do from most anything made by large studios leashed to larger publishers and their shareholders. There's some debate as to whether or not games are actually art, but I feel like this game and other smaller games made as passion projects by small teams, like for example A Space for the Unbound, offer big arguments as to why games are art. To put it simply,
how can a painting have a soul?
It has a soul because it has an identity. It has a heart.
So please buy, play, and enjoy the Thaumaturge. Vote with your wallets, and then go tell the devs how much you love their work. I really hope that if you haven't played this yet, I've convinced you to give it a try. It really is a wonderful and unique experience, and I cannot recommend it enough. So, if you're wondering about how I go about choosing what games to cover here, well, the answer is Audible. No, this isn't a sponsorship, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it. But books, audiobooks, and games are my main forms of media, and often one inspires what I'll be doing with the other. For example, when playing the Thaumaturge, I was listening to A Darker Shade of Magic, a very cool little portal fiction fantasy book about a wizard with a very cool coat. Unfortunately, due to region restrictions, being in Japan, I wasn't able to get the second part when my monthly credit rolled around. So I instead wound up getting a gothic fantasy story called Empire of the Vampire. It's about a vampire hunter named Gabriel, fighting a war against an undead king. You could even call him a Lord of Shadow. Anyway, it's got great snappy dialogue and I really enjoyed it. As such, next time, we're going to be going on a little bit of a monster slaying trip of our own, as we uncover the legend of Gabriel Belmont, and talk about the entire Castlevania Lords of Shadow trilogy.